Obviously, the hot topic of conversation at the moment is lead. You had a very interesting week last week, and we're sort of following on from that, really, aren't we?
No, I was working with one of the ladies that was heavily involved with the Californian condor project, and that is a very, very noteworthy study that's been going on since they've been working with the condors and reintroducing the condors. That was a species that was really on the brink of extinction, and we're actually going to be speaking to Chris Parish, who heads up part of the conservation department from the Peregrine Fund. And he works at the moment with recapturing condors, treating them and re-releasing them for lead issues. And it's really the lead issues that I wanted to speak about, because obviously lead paint was banned in '92, so we've had 28 years knowing that lead was an issue. It's not something that we wanted to subject our children to. So, you know, why it's coming as a surprise to some of the shooting community now really baffles me, because, you know, as I say, we have known it is a bit of an issue. The way I'm viewing this at the moment is viewing it as a positive. It's probably a little bit of an unwelcome kick in the bottom to some, but as far as I'm concerned, yeah, I think we should embrace it, and I'm looking forward to seeing how we can progress with it. Hi there, Chris. How are you doing?
Good.
Excellent. So, I mean, just for our viewers, if you can just give us a bit of a rundown about who you are, what your history is, because I believe, same as from my standpoint, I come from a shooting and a falconry background, and a conservation background. So it's a bit of a mix, and I believe you're a little bit of the same.
Yes, absolutely. I got into fish and wildlife management basically because of my childhood, and that was mostly, with gun or fishing rod in hand, and that kind of led me to the natural resources work and forestry and things like that. And then I found out you could actually have a job being a wildlife biologist. I didn't realize how poorly it paid, but I did find out that you could be a wildlife biologist and work with critters in the outdoors. And I've been able to maintain my love and respect for my hunting heritage and angling heritage, as well as building up my awareness about conservation. And yeah, one thing led to another, and here I am 20 years plus into working with an endangered species, which was not my expected path. But the fact that it has been condors we are working with, and that condors were suffering from lead poisoning, it really couldn't be more perfect, the relationship between me as a hunter and me as a conservation biologist.
Okay, and I mean, obviously, from the shooting background, something that I think, as a community over here and over with you guys, I think conservation has always been at the heart of shooting and hunting, and I think that's very difficult for our protractors to realise. We're not just out there to murder and slaughter everything. A massive part of what we do and what we're involved in is the conservation side as well, looking after habitats.
Absolutely, and that goes for the critters. And I think a new angle of approach in this conversation. It not only goes for conserving those species we care about, it goes for the environments in which they live, and it also goes for the relationship that we as hunters have with the rest of the non-hunting world. Yeah. I think it's just as important that we demonstrate that conservation ethic for those non and especially anti-hunters as it is for the conservation of the species themselves. So we have a ton of things to work on.
Yeah. No, that's it. And I think one of the big things that's affecting, or that's come in recently over here in the UK, is our organisations have come along and said, within 5 years we want to phase out the use of lead within shotgun shells, within cartridges that are being used in shooting for game. So I'm embracing it as a good thing, but obviously there's a lot of guys out there that are not really seeing why, and they don't quite understand the issue of what lead can do in the environment. And that's really, one of the main things I want to speak to you about, is because obviously you've got a vast experience and you've seen it firsthand what lead is doing to wildlife.
Absolutely. And had it not been for my connection to this understanding, that is the science of the relationship between scavenging wildlife and the remains of spent ammunition, whether it be lead shot or fragments from high-powered rifle bullets, or even rimfire. Excuse me. Had it not been for my involvement in those scientific inquiries, I wouldn't have, I would be as skeptical as my fellow hunters are right now. I would be,
Right.
because it's something we've done for generations. And so the first question is, well, wait, how come all of a sudden that's a problem? That sounds a little fishy. And in today's world, with some of the harebrained things that we are attacked upon as hunters, I think skepticism is healthy. But I think what also is healthy is taking a deep dive into our understanding of the relationship between lead and wildlife. And I guess that's what's really changed it for me. And so just a brief history there with my work with condors. We study these condors on an individual basis. This is very, very unusual for wildlife management because you can absolutely say what the limitations on a population are because we study every individual bird of this species in our reintroduction program. So when a bird comes in and it let's say after we put transmitters on it and we put number tags on it and we watch it in the wild and it falls off of its perch to its death, we're able to recover that bird. This is something that usually doesn't happen with an animal that's sick in the wild. When an animal's sick in a natural situation, they go and hole up somewhere, hoping to wait out their ailment and then come through it, hopefully, or be eaten. So in this case, we find them and we're able to take them in and determine what the cause of death was. So after about 4 or 5 years of reintroducing these birds in northern Arizona in the Grand Canyon region, we then began to finally see what those causes of mortality were. And fast track forward to today, 54% of our diagnosed death is caused from lead poisoning. Wow. Now that's I guess I'll break right there because a lot of people say, yes, but how do you know it's coming from ammunition? And the way we went through the process was, I think, a similar way other people think about it is, where could it be coming from? So we looked into, we're in the Grand Canyon region. We have a vertical mile of exposure of topography and layers of geologic formations that you could say maybe the lead is a natural source. Yep. Well, when they look at the type of lead that's showing up in these birds, it's not a homogeneous composition. It's not like a lead ore that would be coming from the ground where we mine lead. It was a heterogeneous composition. So it had all these different types of lead, suggesting that it was a recycled lead. And so then we looked at where these birds were foraging in the wild because we were tracking them. In some cases, we actually even had GPS transmitters on the individual birds so we could tell exactly where they had been prior to our knowledge of them being lead exposed. And we found that lead exposure peaked, and you can see it in the slide that I'll share with you. Lead exposure peaked coinciding with the hunting season. But again, we didn't just rest there with saying, oh, well, there you go, we figured it out. Because we had to ask ourselves, being lifelong hunters, where in the hell are they getting this much lead? We're talking about 80% of the population showing extreme levels of lead coinciding with our deer hunt adjacent to the release site. So I probably set the stage there, and you probably have some questions and ideas about where to take this conversation without me continuing on for the next.
No. I mean, it's fascinating, and it's you're obviously very passionate about it, and you've got the knowledge, which is incredibly important. And I think that's the most important thing, that everything that you're talking about is science based. We're not talking about supposition here. We're talking about actual fact and real case studies. And I think just to get a bit of a bearing on what the Peregrine Fund does and what's been happening with the condors, just to sort of give it a base from where we are. I believe that the population went down to something like 22 individuals originally.
22 individuals in 1982. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then since then, the Peregrine Fund, along with other organisations, have been working tirelessly to bring the populations back up. And I think one of the scary things that sort of came home to me was obviously the percentage that you were talking about. 54% were dying from lead poisoning, but also you're recapturing all of the population every year to test them for lead, if I'm right.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And so the litmus test, or the measurement that we use to assess the availability of lead out there, really the condor couldn't be a better species because they're an obligate scavenger, which also may be why they are more affected than some other species that only scavenge opportunistically, like bald and golden eagles.
Yeah.
But yeah, so after we saw the corresponding high levels of lead in the population and the highest number of lead-caused mortalities each year following the hunting season, then we began to test them prior to and after the hunting season. And really in the beginning, every time we got our hands on a bird for whatever reason, we would draw a blood sample. So in our first study, and I'll refer you to this paper as well, in our first study, we looked at lead levels throughout an annual cycle. And we showed that, in fact, it was what we had observed that first fall in 2002, where we saw the peak. That peak happened every year with those extended levels of lead, which led us to the next question of where are they getting all this lead and how much lead can there possibly be in different things like gut piles? Because here in the States, and it's very common to gut the animal and leave that gut pile in the field. That's just the way it's been done forever. So looking at gut piles, for example, we thought, how many fragments could there possibly be in a single gut pile from a single shot from, say, a 270 caliber, 130 grain 270 rifle bullet? And so that was our next step in the inquiry, where we began by doing a deer study, and we went and shot 34 deer with various types of rifle ammunition, all within what we consider out west here a normal hunting situation, 200 yards and less. And then we x-rayed these animals whole, and then we x-rayed the gut piles. And of course, every animal that we shot with lead-based ammunition contained lead. That was no surprise. What was, however, surprise is that 90% of the gut piles had lead in them. In some cases, up to 400 pieces of lead from a single shot. Now, this, when you see these x-rays and you see this snowstorm effect, basically is what it's been referred to in these gut piles, then it made entire sense as to why the population, 80% of the condors that we were monitoring, were lead exposed each year, because condors feed socially. And they once they learn the lay of the land, just like any other critter out there, they're going to go to where the food is seasonally. And so after the hunting season on the Kaibab for those two-week seasons, the condors are there, and we could see that by our tracking data. So it began to make sense. And this process that I went through is what we have to convey to our fellow hunters so that they can understand. And when we do this, and we've done this for the last 2 decades, when we explain it this way to our fellow hunters, they say, I had no idea that this makes sense. This is not bullshit. This is simple science. And so really, we were so successful, and I'm not tooting our own horn here. I'm saying that it was so successful in sharing the information this way. We thought, how do we do this on a larger scale? Because the implications of what we're finding in the relationship with condors and the remains of lead ammunition in the carrion that they feed upon, what's happening on the rest of the landscape, and how do we share that? And that's really why, a little over a year and a half ago, we launched the North American Non-Lead Partnership. And of course, I'm maybe approaching geezerdom, where I'm becoming this grumpy older gentleman. I'm seeing great. Yeah, it is. And I was like, Jesus, do we need another group and another partnership and another, really, how many groups do we actually need? Well, I think this one was important, because even though, as you said earlier, we tend to feel and believe in our core that conservation and hunting are one and the same, the rest of the world doesn't view it that way. And if we don't maintain that connectivity between hunting and conservation, we stand to lose a lot more than just a few species on the landscape. We stand to lose our right to hunt and the basis and heritage of our hunting, which we all share. Whether people hunt today or not, we all share that. Sure. So that's when it became really a fire in me to share that with my fellow hunters while continuing the science and continuing the recovery program. But what we're really lacking is the ability to effectively communicate today. And so doing things like we're doing today and what you guys are sharing with your audience, it's going to bridge that gap that makes a notion or an effort, like banning lead or voluntarily reducing the amount of lead available to wildlife, there needs to be a lot of explanation. And I think a lot of times when it comes from the top down, we don't always have that information coming up from the bottom. And somewhere we have to meet in the middle.
Exactly. And I think that another couple of things that you touched on there that I really want to sort of understand is that the amount of lead that it actually takes to affect any bird. I mean, especially condors and eagles, which are able to absorb lead because of the pH levels in their gut, or are very good at absorbing lead or dissolving lead. But that goes through for a lot of other species as well. But I think that the thing that is difficult to get over is just how little lead is required to poison a bird of 20 odd pounds in a condor's case.
Yeah, and the sad thing is we really don't know how much is too much.
Yeah.
And so while there could be, and there have been studies in other species, more in humans than anything else, by the way, but when you start mixing and meshing the conversation about human lead exposure and wildlife, people get their hackles up about that too. So I'm not conveniently putting them together. I'm just saying that most of what we know about lead poisoning invertebrate species is from our own species. However, the levels of lead, if you think about, for example, the one I use all the time when I'm giving presentations is we had a big thing in I forget even where it was now, but it was lead in the water in Flint, Michigan. And this was probably heard of worldwide, and people are really worried about this amount of lead. Well, the amount of lead in the water per 1 cup of water wasn't as big a scare as a lifetime of exposure. So the thing about lead and how it affects vertebrate species is much of it is passed through our systems, and different species handle it differently, but lead accumulates over time. And so even if it's very small amounts, over a lifetime, it can accumulate. And then when I say it has different effects, if it's stored in the blood, its half-life is only about 15 days. So right. Lead goes through the system, and half of that level, 15 days later, you'll have half of that level. So it depurates, it removes itself from the system. However, it doesn't all clear the system. As it precipitates out of the bloodstream, it's unfortunately in vertebrate species, it's stored as if it were calcium. And calcium is a major neurotransmitter in our systems and other vertebrate species. And then if you go to think even further about females of the bird world, when they go to lay an egg, they mobilize calcium from their body to build that egg. Think about what might be happening there that we know nothing about. And so my point is, we don't know how much lead is too much lead. But I usually, when we dive off into the science part of this, I usually back myself up where I'm more comfortable too, because I'm kind of a redneck biologist. I say, look, knowing what you know about lead, and it's whether it's good or bad, knowing what you know, would you knowingly consume it? The answer is usually no. So then I take one step further. Would you knowingly put it into a food chain? Now, this is dangerous ground because it sounds like fear mongering, but it's also puts it at a base level of saying, would you knowingly consume lead? Most people would say no. Well, then you definitely wouldn't knowingly put it into a food system, even in small amounts. Yep. And then you get into questions about, well, is it really affecting birds at a population limiting level? Well, now we're talking about wildlife management. We're not talking about what we are talking about, which is the average hunter has no idea that relationship between what we have done for generations and what we now know that can be affecting wildlife, which we usually tend to change if we find out our actions are adversely affecting wildlife. So exactly. There's a huge scale of conversation, and people jump back and forth between, well, it's not affecting eagles at a wildlife population level. Well, no, but that doesn't mean.
Oh, hang on, 2 seconds. Sorry, we just lost you again then for a second. Hang on.
No worries.
Yeah. Go on. Sorry. If you could just recap that bit about the eagles.
You bet. So we have to be careful of which part of this conversation we're talking. And when I'm talking to my fellow hunters, I'm sharing information with them that they can use to inform what type of bullet they use, with new knowledge that little bits of lead might be into the food system because of their choice. That's very different than talking about, do we need to legislate for banning lead nationwide, things like that. So I get the skepticism that folks have, but the relationship is real and it's very well studied. And that's why you're seeing these movements like you're seeing there in the UK.
No, exactly. And I think from that standpoint, the message from lead exposure has been clear, but I think we've just been complicit in its use for the last 20, 30 years. And because, as you say, traditionally that's what we've used, that's what we're comfortable with, that's what we want to continue to work along with. But it's not to the advantage of our food chains, and it's not to the advantage of our wildlife, or even us at the end of the day. So it is. I think it is about time. The science is out there. It's a proven fact, and we need to start acting upon that. I mean, and again, that's something that I'd like to see coming in over here. We move away from using lead rifle ammunition as well. There's some very good alternatives coming available on the markets, which is what we're looking towards. And I think in California, you've even got is it a voluntary or is it a statutory ban on using lead ammunition certain times?
Yeah. Oh, man. It's hard to keep my answers short and succinct when we talk about the politics over here, right? In California, it was a ban. And I have to tell you that, and this is, what they say about opinions, everyone's got one. But the response from the hunting community to that lead ban was a rough one. And I'm not saying it wasn't going to be rough no matter what, but that didn't come from the wildlife management agencies. It didn't come from the scientists doing the work. It came from environmental groups. So you can imagine how that was received. And I think if you look to the history of the only other lead ban that we have here in the States, and that's the banning of lead ammunition for hunting of waterfowl that was came into effect in 1991. People always tell me, because I'm always saying we don't we don't support litigation or legislation to solve this problem. We support outreach and education and incentivization, basically marketing of why it's good to use non-lead for wildlife, rather than hammer down saying we're just going to change the law. And the problem many of us have with that is you can change a law, but are you changing behavior? And people will remind me and say, well, look at lead poisoning in waterfowl. Look what happened. It was banned for that. And I say, yes, in fact, it was. But do you know when the first studies came out showing the deleterious effects of lead shot in waterfowl? It was actually in the UK in the late 1800s, followed by studies in the US in 1887 or something like that. Wow. And then, yes, it was banned in 1991. So 100 years of research and 100 years of informing ourselves, we did as a society come together. Both hunting groups and non-hunting groups came together to say this would be a good thing for wildlife. Yeah. So I guess people tend to forget, we all want a quick fix, right? We all want that pill that takes care of this, But I know what leads to this. It's not because I don't understand the science. I know I'm overweight. So you have to be respectful of how we respond to new technologies. And for those hunters, and I've been there myself, like I said, I'm approaching geezerdom where I don't need another movement to tell me how to be, and I'm fine with how I've been forever. But wait a second. I don't still use cheap binoculars I buy at the 5 and dime, right? I have Swarovski binoculars, or I have Leica binoculars, or I drive a ridiculously technology-filled vehicle to the field. So when hunters say, well, we want to use what we've always used, I don't know, I'm going to question that. Like watching your show, I've seen some pretty fancy technology that hunters will employ should they think that it's going to improve their process in the field. And I think that's the way we have to look at this. When we use research from wildlife management, we're informing how we go to the field and how we operate relative to the field. And that stands to benefit so many different species, and it stands to benefit the future of hunting. And so those two things, I think, will keep my fire lit for as long as I'm breathing.
Oh, superb. No, I love your take on that, and I think that's it. If those studies were coming out in the late 1800s, and everybody's up in arms at the moment because we've given ourselves 5 years. It's not like the writing wasn't on the wall. We've had the chance. We've got the opportunity to change it for ourselves now before somebody comes in and legislates against us. And I think that's the biggest thing. If we're taking control of it and we can guide the way that we go forward, and guide the way that we're working with the new technologies, then it's going to be better for everybody. We've had time to procrastinate. We've had time to sit on our laurels. We've used this technology. We were happy with it, and we haven't wanted to go forward. So I really do think we do need that little bit of a kick in the butt at the moment just to move us forward, which is hopefully what this is going to do. Absolutely.
And here in the States, and I assume that it's very similar there, except just, much longer history with conservation and the opportunities we have as hunters and anglers to do things good for wildlife. This is an opportunity. And if we capitalize on this opportunity, it will go down as yet another positive response to new information and being truly the conservationists we claim to be. And over here in the States, it's always, our forefathers, Teddy Roosevelt, things like that. It's like, well, come on, folks. That wasn't very long ago, one. And do we really need to continue just to ride on the coattails of those people who did some amazing things 150 years ago? What about what we have the opportunity to do today? And this gives me great hope. When we collected our information on the condor specific to northern Arizona, we went to the Arizona Game and Fish Department and shared with them the data we had, and it all was very clear and compelling. But here's what's interesting. We didn't go to them and say, we've got to ban lead if we're going to save the condor. What we said is, hunters need to know this. And if they come to know it like we know it, we suspect with a little incentivization and a little guidance that they will answer the call to conservation. And here's what they did. In 2005, they launched the first program after appealing to the hunters and sharing with them the data. And the hunters said, show us the data, show us the science. So we sent them 3 pages front and back in type 8 font of all of the science. And then they mounted a program whereby a hunter who was lucky enough to be drawn for that region would get 2 free boxes of non-lead ammunition. And so the first year we only had 50% participation. And we thought, why in the world aren't people taking free ammunition? And we shared the science, and they said they wanted the science. And then we found out through further surveys, we said, did you read the science you asked for? And most hunters said, well, I think I remember getting something there, but no, I don't think I read it. Well, why? Because we in conservation science, we suck at selling our product, right? Yeah. We are taught to go write the publication, do the study, write it up, get it published in a peer-reviewed journal, and voila, you're done. Well, you're not done, because that's just science. Unless you take science and do something with it, you're not making it conservation. So we figured out, okay, we have to figure out how to market the products of our scientific inquiry in a way that is recognizable as something that they should want to look at. And so we did a few things in the next year and a half, 2 years. We made a small video, a DVD, where it had, information on how to improve the success of your hunt and the information that we have gleaned from our scientific studies with condors. And the same incentives of now you can have a free box of ammunition. Or even further, if hunters, you might wait 10 years to get drawn for that tag. So the last thing you want to do is use something new, unless it's thought to improve your potential for success. So we knew that this would be a tough sell, but we said, even if you use lead, you can remove the gut pile and still interrupt that opportunity for lead exposure in wildlife. And we had quite a few hunters do that. I'll end it with this because I talk too damn much. If you look at the last 12 years, we have maintained 87% annual, 87% voluntary participation to either using non-lead ammunition or removing leaded gut piles from the field. That demonstrates the ethic and what hunters are willing to do. So when I hear environmental groups, and that's a terrible thing to call them because I'm environmental, I care about the environment, as do most hunters, but these more aggressive groups that don't have hunting in their and don't recognize hunting in their heritage, when they tell me nothing is being done and hunters don't care, I call BS on that. I say, no. The hunters that have been engaged in an effective way, 87% of them annually either use non-lead or haul gut piles from the field. We're talking 47 tons 1 year of gut piles hauled from the field because hunters were willing to go the extra mile for conservation. That's what we're dealing with. How do we get that out there? And I thank you for giving us the opportunity to share some of this story with your listeners.
No, thank you very much. And I mean, what you've discussed with us has been absolutely superb. And I think you've really hit the nail on the head about where we are as a hunting community and how we can take it forward. But just wanted to recap on a couple of points. The 80 or the percentage of birds that you're recapturing that have got lead levels. Are you seeing? Obviously you're treating them for lead ingestion and for lead poisoning, but obviously it's not just the catastrophic cases that we're seeing with the deaths, with the die-off, but it's also the non-breeding success that then that progresses through, not just with the condors, but with a lot of other birds as well.
Absolutely, and I think. People ask me all the time, well, if you've been so successful after the little piece that I just gave you, how come we're still having to treat condors for lead exposure? And the answer is very simple. It's the same reason other birds are exposed. Condors don't just feed two-week periods out of the year on the Kaibab Plateau where we're deer hunting. Deer hunting is one potential contributing factor to that lead. And condors don't just eat in northern Arizona. They go into Utah. They don't observe state lines. They're eating carrion year round. And of the carrion, we've only addressed one small portion, and that is the two-week deer seasons. So what about the rest of hunting out there that we do? What about even this? This is kind of the Wild West. When you look at the old Westerns and the hoodoos and the Monument Valley, that's the country we're talking about here. When a cow gets sick or a horse gets sick and a rancher finds it, they usually put it down. They usually put it out of its misery. And what do they do that with? Their standard sidearm or the rifle they have in the truck. What's it loaded with? Probably lead-based ammunition. So what about law enforcement? When you have an animal that's wounded by a vehicle on the roadside, you put it out of its misery. What do you do that with? So it's not just hunting, and I think that's a very important part of this message, is we're not just saying that hunters are the problem. There's an issue also with poaching. And if you want to tackle something difficult, how do you tackle getting poachers to use non-lead ammunition? I mean, anyway, what I'm saying is that we have only addressed a very small portion of the contributions of lead to the environment. If we use that effectively as a tool to demonstrate what we are capable of as hunters and take it to a landscape scale, that's when we'll see the difference in species like the condor. We have seen a bit of a plateauing out. We're not seeing extreme spikes from one year to the next. It's pretty steady, but it's still what we would definitely classify as unsustainably high levels of lead and lead-caused mortality still today. But that's given the game of the condor. These birds aren't sexually mature until 8 years of age. They can reproduce at 5 and 6 for males and females respectively, but they're usually not successful in their first young until 8, and then they only have one chick every other year. So the condor is probably the best canary in the coal mine, if you will, because if we solve the problem of lead exposure through the studies of the condor, we will have done so much good for the greater environment that I think it's almost inconceivable for people. So I remind people, it's not about saving this one endangered species, but look what we've learned through our work with this one endangered species. We've learned about something that's happening on a landscape scale. And so I'll take you through, and your viewers, through another process that I went through, just to say how thick-skulled I am, because I don't think change comes easy to any of us.
Yep.
When we were doing our deer fragmentation study up in Wyoming, northern Wyoming, every 3 days, because we would go and kill a handful of deer, and we would x-ray them whole, and then we'd take the gut piles and x-ray the gut piles. Well, we needed to place those deer at different game processing butcher shops. And so it took a day and a half to place all those deer. So our drivers that we had driving deer for us, they would, driving it to the butcher, not beaters. I learned a little stuff last night watching your videos. But we would have a day off, basically. And during that day off, we would do what all hunters do and all biologists seem to do. Well, let's go hunt something else, because we were in a new region and we had sharp-tailed grouse and sage grouse and pheasants and Hungarian partridge. And so we thought, well, let's take the bird dogs and let's go hunting. So I called my wife one day while coming home from one of these trips on our day off. And she said, what are you so excited? I said, oh my gosh, I have pheasant, sharp-tailed grouse, Hungarian partridge. We're harvesting all these game birds on our days off, and I'm going to have all this meat from the study, and we're going to have all these game birds that I'm bringing home. She goes, what'd you shoot them with? I was like, well, the Hungarian partridge I shot with my 410, quite proud of that. And I shot the other ones with a 12 gauge. She goes, no, what ammo? And I was like, well, the same ammo? I get what you're asking. You're making the assumption that lead. Yeah, I shot it with lead.
Lead.
Yeah. I knew, but I didn't make the connection that this lead in this other form may be affecting other species. And I come from a bit of a raptor background, as you do. And so my first thought is, okay, so let's say you wound and it flies off and then a goshawk nails it.
Yep.
I never had thought about that. Now, it's not because I'm an idiot. I'm a conservation scientist, but my habits and my traditions had not converged with the information in such a way that resulted in my wife's automatic conclusion that, what are you doing? I was like, I hadn't thought about it. So anyway, we all go through that process.
And that's something that I experienced many years ago. I used to, I still do breed a lot of bird of prey, but I used to breed a few different species of vultures. And I had some Himalayan griffin vultures. And I went out, I always used to go out with a goshawk, catch a few rabbits. And then when I came back, I'd give the rabbits to the other birds. On this particular day, threw a rabbit in with the griffins. Didn't think anything of it, and then a few days later the female of the pair was down on her hocks stargazing in an awful state. Took her to the vets, got a scan, we did the test and everything else, and it was one number 6 shot that had done that to her and just completely wiped her out. And she even though we were quick and we got her when we treated her, she, from that point on, she still always had neurological issues. And that was the dawning time for me, and that's what we're seeing a lot now with the pheasant shooting, because it's a very, very big industry over here is driven game birds, and that's what we're seeing with some of the main problems we're seeing with it, that there is a number of birds that are getting shot at that are not being killed outright, that are then surviving, going off, and then they are going to be predated by other species. And also, obviously, the pheasant flesh going into the human market, which is becoming more and more or increasingly difficult because nobody wants to take it because it's got a toxin in it. So, these are the points that were sort of pivotal for me, and I think that we're now hopefully going to be addressing, and we're going to go forward with it. But no, just absolutely blown away, and I can't thank you enough for your time and for your conservation work as well. So. No, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and hopefully we'll get a chance to meet up someday.
Well, I'd say when I end all of these conversations, when I meet fellow hunters from new places, that we got to get out in the field together.
No, definitely. Amen to that. Good seeing you. Take care.
Can I throw in a question?
Oh, hang on. David just wants to ask you a question. Hold on.
Chris, can I just ask you, when you were doing your analysis on the deer, and there was this snowflake effect that you called it. Where were you shooting the deer? Was that in the shoulder?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, all through the vitals areas. Yeah, and I'll send you that. It's Hunt et al. So Granger Hunt was my science advisor for the Peregrine Fund, but it's Hunt et al. 2006, and it's there are several different versions that we produced there. But you can look at all the details there on that, and maybe I'll provide you a link so you can give that to your viewers. But they were all thoracic shots in the vitals of the heart and lungs. Except for the two. Remember I said that 90% of the gut piles had lead? The only two deer that didn't have lead in the gut pile were deer that I shot in the head, because I thought, well, this does happen, and I want to see what fragmentation happens in the head. So those were only two deer that didn't have fragments in the gut pile.
In the gut pile. And with those, were you seeing a lot of lead going down into the neck as well, or?
Oh man, yeah. Whenever a bullet hits bone, even fur, it tends to fragment more. I mean, we do an awful lot of bullet testing, and that's what I was doing yesterday when you had called. Was I take the fragments that we harvest from doing our bullet demonstrations, where we shoot into a water chamber with both lead and non-lead to show the difference between fragmentation. And then I harvest those fragments and put them through a coffee filter and then dry them out. And then I sprinkle them in little epoxy pucks, so that I can go around and show hunters, here's how small these fragments are, to demonstrate how we might have missed them all these years in our harvesting and cleaning the animals. And yeah, people are blown away by it. But when you see a bullet hit bone, it can travel as much as 15 inches away from the path of the bullet.
Right. Yeah, that's a lot of carcass, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. So I have one image in particular in my slide presentation that I'll share with you all. And this image basically shows that when a bullet hits the spinal column, you can see the fragmentation begins upon impact into the skin. But by the time that bullet impacts the spinal column and comes out the other side, it's just a slew of fragmentation, some of which are bone fragments, but you can see the lead and the copper as it expands out there. And the x-rays of the ballistics gelatin that we shoot as well, that's another one that really does a good job at demonstrating that.
Well, no, I mean, anything you've got like that would be absolutely superb. So, any clips, and if you have got any of your any videos of your conservation work with the handling the condors and stuff like that, that would be absolutely wonderful. But
I'll ask another question.
What's that? Oh, hang on, David's got another question coming. You might as well come in.
Maybe Roy, you can ask it. I'm just intrigued. If you were going to do that extra day's hunting on the grouse and the pheasant that you did, what shells would you be taking? What's available in the States?
Yeah, so the good news is that availability for both shot shells and centerfire rifle ammunition and rimfire rifle ammunition, it's getting better every year. But if I were to go to the field today, and I just did this last year, I'm using a 20 gauge with steel shot. Actually, I'm using high brass number 6 and high brass 7 for the smaller game birds like quail, and then I would drop down to 6s for the sharp-tailed grouse that we hunt. And I use steel, and because if I wasn't a broke biologist, I would probably shoot bismuth. And actually, I'll probably end up shooting with more bismuth as time goes on. I'm becoming a little more choosy in my age as well with the shots I take, and I don't mind spending more money per shot, because I'm not in that phase of my life where I, want to go to Argentina and see the rib be melted off of a barrel shooting doves. I still wouldn't object to going to do that, but I'm just saying, for my harvest and the type of hunting I do, it's not as big of an imposition to just shoot fewer shells and be more sure of each of those, because of both the cost of the bullets, but also the cost to the wildlife. What I shoot at, I want to take home and eat.
No, exactly.
Do you think, just last question from me, do you think that because part of this process, the conversations are easier now with all environmental groups, whether they're the more extreme or the sort of the ones with maybe the lighter media impact? Do you think that they're seeing hunters in a different light?
Absolutely. Actually, there's some fantastic survey work that happened here in the last 5 years in the U.S. And unfortunately, I have not read the paper, but I've heard about it a lot. And if you look at how hunting is viewed in the U.S., a very, very high percentage, like in the 80 percentile, of people supported regulated hunting. And so I think the whole locavore movement, the clean food movement, the eating local movement, and I think we're seeing a shift. I really do. I wouldn't say that to result in letting our guard down against defending our rights and for hunting and our hunting heritage. But I think with movements like this, just as you said, people are seeing that, wow, these hunters are also conservationists. And that's a perfect full circle to where we started the conversation when you said some people cannot imagine that a guy who works on an endangered species recovery program is I don't know, probably some would look at me as a rabid hunter, but I think it is changing. That dynamic in the demographic, those things are changing, and that's a good thing.
No, superb. I mean, that's it, and it's hopefully we can take it forward, and we're going to see improvements all the way through. But again, I think this is just the very very first steps of a long path we've still got to walk. But it's I think as a hunting community, it's something that we should definitely be embracing. Both with shotgun ammunition and as you guys are demonstrating over there with rifle ammunition as well. So. Hopefully it will take us forward, and we'll be able to achieve what needs to be done. And again, I think this is the main thing for a lot of people to take away. If we don't address this ourselves, then it will be addressed for us.
That's right. Right. Well said.
Superb. But no, thank you very much again for your time. And once I'll definitely catch up with you at some point in the near future, and we'll get together and go out on that hunt.
Sounds great.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks for your time, Chris.
Cheers.